Hi there, I'm Kevin Arrowsmith from Turnkey Consulting, and I'm going to be talking about breaking down the silos, especially from a risk management perspective. Now, silos in an organisation really means the different functions, the different areas of the business or the different departments that are all trying to manage risk based upon how they need to manage risk for their particular function. Now, if we think about that in an IT world, we've got a lot of the IT, the cyber risks, things like accessing systems, the data privacy, breach, all of those things. Then we've got finance. Then we think about a lot of the financial related risks, so ensuring that revenues continue. What about fraud if people try to defraud the organisation and steal money? Then of course we start thinking about the HR risks. So what about the joiners, movers, leavers? What about some of the critical staff or some of the critical roles not being filled in time so that business operations are impacted? Now I can keep going on across all the different functions, but hopefully you get the picture. Now from a risk management perspective, what a lot of organisations start with is they might start with one particular area. So that could be IT, it could be finance. Now the reason why I pick on both IT and finance is because it's quite often it's one of those two functions or silos in the organisation that actually ends up kicking off a new enterprise risk management strategy. So if we took IT, for example, they might be managing a lot of their risks on good old spreadsheets. They might have maybe a SharePoint system. Terrible drawing there. But they've got lots of different forms that a lot of their user base or even people around the organisation to raise risks or incidents relating to IT risks. Now the problem here is with Excel, how do you then get that into a nice report format, into the form of pie charts, the different dashboard styles that are all then required? Well, unfortunately, that then takes pretty much a human being to be able to try and do a lot of that reporting manually and by hand. If you think about within IT, there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of individual risks that are being managed, from quite low down operational risks up to the enterprise. So for one individual to comb through all of that information through manual spreadsheets, that's quite a challenge. Now, quite often, different areas of IT, especially if they are geographically segregated, end up having their own versions of these Excel spreadsheets. So that one individual or maybe team end up having to try and manage all of these different spreadsheets in different formats, in different styles, and all capturing completely different information. So that leads to a massive amount of manual effort to try and comb through. And then the final note that I'll make, that what a lot of organisations have is an individual or maybe a team, so risk and controls team, who then take the feeds of information from IT, from finance, from HR, from sales, from logistics, all with their own different formats. And then you end up exacerbating the problems, especially when it comes to sort of the manual aggregation of the risk and controls team. Now, the risk and controls team is really there to help guide the organisation to manage risk better and mitigate the overall impact for the organisation. not to essentially end up becoming a data analyst to try and comb through all of this information. Now, one thing that stayed with me for the many years that I've been in risk management is the fact that there is one risk and controls coordinator that I know, in fact a group risk manager, who ended up spending 3 months every single quarter, so yes, that's not a typo, so for the entire quarter, combing through all of this information manually to then finally create the graph required for the board. There's a crazy amount of time for a group risk manager to be able to have to comb through all of that information. So how on earth do organisations cope with this? Well, this is where you start thinking about and putting in place a central risk register. I'm just going to abbreviate it to risk register because my typing is quite large. Now, that could be in the form of a tool, which quite often technology helps enable that, so that you'll end up with a centralized tool which all of the different functions or departments can then start feeding their information into. But actually, organizations really don't benefit a lot from doing a big bang approach to go from, well, day one, every single department or function within the organization all starts having to feed in their risks into a central risk register. To be honest, that just won't happen. Now, what an organization tends to do, or from a best practice point of view, is focus on one particular area. Now, what that enables in this respect is that you can start templating the tool, you can start standardizing the approach, and you can start putting together a better risk data model. So those three things really are supported when you start looking at one individual function or department within an organisation like IT. You can start templating the way in which risks are captured. You can start standardising the approach to risk management. So that's where you can start enabling from a group perspective, maybe moving towards either a 3x3, 4x4, 5x5 type matrix that is then going to make sense across the organisation. And then finally, when you look at the risk data model, that's where you can start thinking about the master data that you're capturing. It's really important to get this bit right. So I'm going to really underline that point. Now, why is that? Essentially, crap in equals crap out. You need to try and think about the way in which your master data model will work for your organisation and the reporting requirements to report directly up to the board. You also need to think about how you're going to bridge that gap between the operational risk and the enterprise risk. So how are you going to get all of those very low level on the shop floor risks, very operational, they might need their own independent risk assessments performed against them. But how are you going to then surface that information in a logical, aggregated way up to the enterprise? So that is where it's really important to get that master data model correct. There is absolutely no point in capturing information which serves no purpose to the board, no purpose to any regulatory requirements, and therefore why are you capturing information that is simply not required in reports? You're just overburdening the end users. Now, a lot of organisations ask me, well, how long does that take to try and get one of these functions right? How long does it take me to template, standardise? Well, from a tooling perspective, that can sometimes be up and running relatively quickly. So in a general sense, you might be looking at, it's definitely not 6 months. You might be looking at maybe 6 weeks or so to get a tool up and ready. It does depending on the tool type that you are looking to get, whether it's a cloud-based solution, whether it's on-premise. Obviously, from an on-premise perspective, there's a lot more control around that, and some of the integrations tend to be a bit more enhanced than the software as a service type products. But again, there are APIs and web services. But in general, try to think about roughly about 6 weeks to try and get your central tool up and running. Then when you start thinking about the templating, the standardizing, and then the risk data model, and trying to get that right for within IT, you might be looking at anywhere between sort of 8 to 12 weeks to get that up and running. Now, what that will then enable is that IT will start having a more mature process in which to capture and manage their risks. Now, that's fine. That's IT sorted. So then how do you then move that? Well, let's then take the finance area, for example. Now, what you can do is you can start taking all of that. I'm just going to get rid of that. You can start taking all of that momentum within IT and start moving that into finance. You've then got that template already sorted. And so it's only minimal changes then that are needed to support the finance risk capture requirements. You've got that nice standardized approach to capturing risk, to the process relating to risk. Now, there might be some different workflows or processes required for finance to capture that, but you've got that basic baseline concept and that standardized approach. And then you've probably started to guess this. If we then look at the data model, again, you've got that good baseline concept of what the right risk data model looks like. And then again, it's just small tweaks to make it relevant for finance. So then we take the momentum again, and then maybe we can move to HR or any other function or department. You can then start leading in again with that 3-step process, get the template, standardize the processes, and then you've got it, sort out that risk data model again. And all the time you can start to see the benefit of all of these functions feeding in information. So that tool starts to get better and better. And that's where you can really start taking that momentum then to the rest of the group of your organization. So again, organizations tend to ask, well, where do we start? Well, pick a function or a department within the organization that is willing to change, willing to transform the way in which they're capturing risks across their department. Standardize that approach and then use the momentum to go from department to department. Now, what often happens is they pick a particular geographical function or legal entity to start driving this momentum out and then start broaching that up into the group. Now, just moving across. Now, there's another approach here, because you've probably started to think, well, hold on, that program might take me an awful long time to try and get through. So you're right, it might do, especially when you start looking at 8 to 12 weeks per individual function. There are ways to accelerate that, but also there are some aspects which may end up elongating that process, especially if the organisation or the departments are not willing to change. So there might be a lot of process changes underlying and culture changes to try and address that. So another way in which you can adopt this, if we start thinking about this from a tooling perspective, is we still go for our function that is willing to change. Again, I'm picking on IT here, maybe it's unfair, but I'm picking on them. So we start automating the capture and the aggregation of the risk into the tool. Now, it might be that we could be for logistics or operations. We might be 1 to 2 years away from getting to improving ops. How do we bridge that gap? Well, this is the great bit. If you've got a tool that enables you to capture your information as you need and automate a lot of the risk management capture, identification and management, and automate the reporting side of things, so you're getting IT ready, you're then moving on to finance, for example, but you don't want to leave ops behind for 1 to 2 years. That is where you can start to use manual feeds. Now, there's a couple of things that we can do here. We can either push data we can either push the data, so we can use technology to push the data from ops into risk management. So we can have a standardized Excel template or spreadsheet, something like that, where we can push that data directly into the risk management tool. Or you can use key risk indicators. You can send out to ops managers or risk managers within the ops function to complete certain KRIs so that they can start feeding in, say, the number of incidents in ops, the current SLAs relating to ops. So all of these different information can then be captured in key risk indicators that are pushed over to the ops managers. They simply complete a form. It could be Excel, it could be an online form. And then that KRI information is then uploaded directly into the risk management tool. So then that underpins the enterprise reporting objectives. So you're catering for IT and you're transforming the risk function for IT, and you're taking that forward and gaining the momentum to gradually grow that out across the different departments of the organization, but you're not leaving other areas of the organization behind, like ops. You're actually catering for their need, and you're catering for the enterprise need to capture risk. And then subsequently, the impact is you're supporting better reporting for the board to make better and more effective decisions. So for ops, you're actually supporting them from a manual process, but you're asking them to complete specific KRIs which are required for the management reports. Now, from a tooling perspective, there's different ways of doing that. So like I mentioned, there's the forms that can be created and sent out. Those could be forms that are directly coming out from the management tool. So any information that's captured is then directly inputted. You could do good old Excel. You could send out Excel spreadsheets, capture the information, and then manually upload those KRIs into the risk tool. Or you can take feeds of information. So if ops, for example, have got their own system in place, this could be an ERP type system which you need to get information out of. That's where you can then create web services or APIs to then pull that information directly. So you can then take the feed of information directly from the data tables from within the ERP system or whichever system that you have. So it's SAP, Oracle, Navision, etc. So you can pull that information directly into the risk management tool. So how does that then look? I'm going to change the colours here. So risk management, that is our platform. Risk management platform. You then end up with a working model of IT automating the feed of information into the platform. You then got finance. Again, they could be automating. So maybe we're 3 to 4 months into our program. But then you end up with the different and other areas and silos: ops, HR, sales, all manually feeding in information directly up to the risk platform through means of either KRIs or APIs, which then actually automates the process. And again, we look to this for HR. All in the meantime, ops, HR, sales, all of these are waiting to come on board to the platform, are still managing and capturing risk in their own way. So you don't necessarily need to change that process until you're ready to transform that overall function. So the great thing here is, from a business as usual, they will continue to capture information, but you are supplementing that by either requesting specific KRIs, which doesn't pose a massive admin overhead. That could be a monthly process to capture KRIs on a monthly basis for very specific areas which are needed for the management reports. That then frees up that individual person that I talked about right at the very start of this from having to do a lot of that data cleansing exercise. You're actually using the tool to help capture the manual KRIs that individual person requires to aggregate all the information for the management reports, rather than them having to sift through all the different Excels and the other niche ways in which all of these different functions are capturing their risks. So it is then a blend of automating a lot of that It is then automating a lot of that capturing for the different functions that are transforming along the program, but then still catering for all of those other functions that may be a few months or a few years away from adopting that overall risk management platform. Now that process and that approach very much also applies to organizations from a group perspective that maybe has a geographically local entity that is kicking off a risk management platform, which potentially the rest of the group will end up benefiting from, but you need to start. You need to prove that it works, and you need to gain the momentum within a particular department, within a particular geography, to start moving and taking that momentum to start building your overall enterprise risk management picture out for the rest of the organization. So in a nutshell, that is where technology can really enable more effective decision making, but also support a lot of the other silos within the organization. So finally, we end up bridging that gap. So IT information gets pushed over, HR, finance, ops, in all of those different ways. So those could be automated, and you could have a blend of manual. But in the platform, you end up with a central risk register. You end up with the KRIs required for reporting, so you get better and more effective decision making. There are, of course, many different approaches to tackle, but from the conversations that we've had with organisations, it's good to start small, start with one area willing to change, and then use that momentum to go down and start building out the rest of that for the other areas of the organisation. And that is how you can then tackle the people, the processes and the culture to risk management. I've been Cavan Arrowsmith. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope that's been useful.